Okay, good evening, everybody, colleagues. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ed, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences here at Lancaster University. For those of you who are not colleagues, who've come from outside the university, a very warm welcome. But I'm here to introduce Professor Richard Brook, to you on behalf of the faculty and the university. Richard is both a registered architect and holds a doctoral qualification in architectural history. He's had experience in industry, after which he joined the Manchester School of Architecture in 2007. Became a professor in 2020, congratulations for that, and then joined Lancaster in 2022, where, as many of you know, and I can probably recognize you with the glasses and haircuts, we've formed a new and exciting architectural school, department, which is growing, ambitious, and importantly, chomping on the bit to make its own future. As an architectural historian, Richard's work has focused on the post-war period, and he takes what he calls a holistic view. That's to say, informed of an awareness of many different political and cultural ideas that influence design and practice. Conventionally, scholarly undertaking for architectural historians is something of a lone practice. Time spent sitting in archives, but Richard's work is founded on such conventions, but draws on his experience as an architect and combines creative, communicative, and engaged aspects of the profession with the discipline of architectural history. His success is evident in the number of awards he's received from RIBA, AHRC, EPSRC, and the Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art. All those combinations of letters are notable institutions that fund things like research in universities. But in particular, I want to draw out from Richard's work that his research has resulted in several buildings being listed, protected in some way, and I think this represents a major feat since the statutory protection of post-war structures is difficult because the evidential threshold tends to be set so high. And Historic England testified that without Richard's work, these unknown structures would have remained outside the strategic planning system, and they'd have been unprotected. So I think there's a really interesting intervention. Richard's advisor to a modernist society, an active member of the 20th Century Society. He's convened conferences and judged prizes. This year, we'll see the publication of a long-awaited monograph, a phrase often associated with academic books, called The Renewal of Post-War Manchester, Planning, Architecture and the State, and that will be published with Manchester University Press. Since arriving at Lancaster University, Richard's been busy making connections and innovating our practices, working with library students to create new digital records of the architectural history of the university, which will happen over the coming years, and leading an initiative to look at the history and theory of sustainability, which I think is also a really interesting initiative and something that the Dean hopes will feed and drive Lancaster University's more general approach to the topic of sustainability. Finally, I'd like to say that inaugural lectures are special occasions. They're a celebration and they're a recognition of colleagues' productivity and their excellence. But it's also an opportunity for a colleague to showcase their research to a mixed and supportive audience. But it's also an occasion for us all to look forward to see what a new professor will contribute to the future, what they will build in a new university as they enter a new career phase, a career phase that comes with leadership responsibilities and the generation of a new cohort of scholars into the future. So being a professor is an achievement and a responsibility. Richard.
Thank you, Ed. And thank you, everybody, for coming along. It's absolutely fantastic to see friends, colleagues, people that I've spent a lot of time with, studying, playing, talking, mixing ideas, and family as well. It's fantastic to have my mum and dad here tonight. So this evening, I'm going to talk about the M62 motorway. This is a kind of deeply personal story because I grew up in a house in Chorley in Lancashire, which was finished in 1977, and we moved in early 1978. Mono-pitched house, reduced from £16,000 to £15,000 because they weren't selling very well, because they looked too weird. My dad, being a Yorkshireman, liked the fact that it was reduced. But I think this stuff was really formative. You know, I grew up effectively in a modernist house in an incomplete new town. Astley Village was part of central Lancashire New Town, which was the last new town to be designated, but never really completed. So as such, in Chorley with maternal grandparents in Liverpool and paternal grandparents in Leeds, we spent a lot of time on motorways, travelling from Chorley. If we were heading east, we'd often come past Booth Wood Reservoir, and the game for us in the back of the car was looking at the spillway and seeing if the reservoir was high enough for the water to actually be tipping over the edge. Subsequently, and you'll see this throughout the lecture, I do a lot of field work, so I like to visit these places. So a lot of the photographs are my own today, author's own, you'll see that. When we were coming back from Liverpool, we travelled on the M58 and the M6, and the game there would be the first person to spot the 57 on the Heinz factory in Wigan. Little did I know at the time that the Heinz factory in Wigan was actually designed in collaboration with Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, a very significant American modernist practice. As we headed towards my grandma's in Liverpool, the game was to see who could spot the cranes at Bootle Docks. And I don't know if I've ever told anybody this before in my life. Mum and Dad, you can tell me whether I've told you this or not. But probably for more than a decade, I thought there was a place called Bootle All Docks. It transpires the two things are in the same direction. When we were travelling on the M62, as we crossed the boundary between Lancashire and Yorkshire, just before my dad declared that we'd entered sunny Yorkshire, he would have us cheer at the boundary markers as we went over the top. And the reason I put these in here wasn't to make that anecdote, but was actually just to remember two people, Aidan Turner Bishop and Elaine Harwood, both of whom sadly passed away recently. And Aidan was from Preston and one of the best historians you could encounter, probably second only to Elaine. But it was Aidan who had the idea that these markers, these boundary markers that were listed at the Platinum Jubilee to commemorate Queen Elizabeth II, it was Aidan's idea that these were actually culturally valuable. And Elaine Harwood was probably the greatest historian of post-war British architecture that we had. Elaine was a fantastic supporter of my work. She's probably the most generous scholar that I've ever encountered. Anybody that she could see who had a passion, she would support them. And she died very suddenly and has been a great loss to the architectural history community. So this lecture that I'll give this evening really began its life in a conference that we convened in 2019 at the Manchester School of Architecture, supported by the Paul Mellon Centre. Little did I know when I put the poster together that I would be delivering this lecture here in Lancaster, just up the road from Fortin Services. So the project was in collaboration with Professor Shapelic-Noor, who unfortunately isn't here this evening. She's doing another event in Birmingham, I think. But Mike's here to represent Birmingham, so thanks, Mike. But she and I have worked really closely together, and she's really helped me to develop my understanding of landscape and the value of landscape within the context of post-war history. This project's been just about coming to a conclusion, and this was one of the events, the first things that I've done since we arrived at Lancaster. Michael and Graham are here this evening. Michael, the filmmaker, and Graham did the score for this kind of immersive filmic experience about the birth, life and death of the coal-fired power stations and the effects that those changes are having on community. It's been a rangy project. It's been one that's enabled us to work with the Modernist Society, to work with the painter Jen Orpin, who also sadly can't be here this evening. But with Jen, we convened some artist conversations. We curated an exhibition. That exhibition made the pages of The Observer. And Eddie from the Modernist Society commissioned Jen to make this painting of Snow Hill Bridge, which I now drive under every time I come to Lancaster. And my fantastic colleagues from Manchester School of Architecture gifted me this painting by Jen as I left there to join Lancaster. I've also had the opportunity to work with Michael, not just on the film, but in an upcoming exhibition where we'll be talking more broadly about the M62 in relation to the north and infrastructure and the way that it connects that landscape right the way across. This evening I'm going to focus much more on a particular section. Michael's making some rather fantastic carbon prints with a guy called Bob France. So Michael's surname is England, and he's working with Bob France on this project, which is sort of beautiful, reaching out to Europe. Carbon printing is like platinum printing, but it's a bit of alchemy, and it's taken Bob ages to get the process absolutely down, and it's still subject to error for unknown reasons. But we collected coal, Michael and I, from Fiddler's Ferry power station, and we've crushed the coal, and Bob's using that coal to make these prints. So it's a really exciting project that's got a kind of wonderful kind of circular nature to it. I also collect a lot of things. Anyone who's ever been in my office or my house, in fact, I spoke to my wife, who also can't be here this evening, and we realised that we've filled up another house and we might have to buy a bigger one. But ephemera is really important to me. It's often the things that don't make libraries or they get lost. So things that you find at car boot sales or on eBay, usually things that nobody else wants. And the first things I've bought in relation to this place are a couple of postcards of Lancaster University itself and one of the most striking buildings on campus, the chaplaincy. The chaplaincy was designed by Cassidy and Ashton, who did an extension to the school of which my father was the head teacher, and he got me a job, a work experience at Cassidy and Ashton in Manchester, which was my first encounter with an architectural practice. So again, there's this sort of beautiful kind of resonance, really, with this place and with this lecture this evening. Somebody wrote on the back of these to their parents, I assume, and if you don't mind, I'm going to read them. In this photo, you can see the whole length of the university. It's long and thin. The arrow marks where my block is. We all think it's the best place out of the whole university, near enough to the main part, but far enough away so that it's not too noisy, particularly at night. Hugh, you'll be able to testify to this. We can hear the motorway, not shown in this photo, and we can hear the railway, which is shown. But the noise is very limited, so it doesn't really worry us. The chaplaincy centre is very big. Actually, is a good socialising place. Serves all religions and baked beans. When we go down to the duck pond or the health centre, we have to pass it. I'd like to send you a photo of both of those places, but I haven't seen one. The health centre is a very old and beautiful house set in the middle of some woods and surrounded by a small but beautifully kept garden. And that's where I work now, Balerig House. So I didn't know the message when I got them off eBay. I didn't know the writing was on the back, so they're a really nice thing to have. Writing for a Canadian audience in 1962, Robert Furneaux Jordan felt sufficiently distant from architectural goings-on in the UK to pen the following. While we are dazzled by the stylistic gymnastics of artist architects south of the border, across the Atlantic, the British slowly evolved prototypes of social forms. From the simple dwelling to the complex town, the British have explored and evolved methods to order their environment. In their earnest approach to architecture as a community service, the British have almost eliminated the architect of individualistic talent. For the sake of making a point, I've edited the quotes. The full paragraph suggested that Canada could possibly marry the background approach of British post-war architecture with the foreground frenzy of the United States. Furneaux Jordan also wanted to single out Dennis Lasdon as one UK architect who booked the trend and was internationally important. More helpful to me is this gesture towards mainstream modernism, or rather the implication that the welfare state and the social contract it embodied extended all the way into the outcomes in the built environment. Many historians would use matters of building licensing, rationing, exhausted government coffers, a need for speedy construction, and an embrace of system building to explain the particular stylistic leanings of post-war British architecture. Here, Furneaux Jordan supposes that a drive to design for all, an underwritten acceptance of egalitarianism made for a lack of individualism, and a consensual everyday architecture that was about life and not the joy of living. Now, this was written in '62, and I think it's fair to say that after that, mainstream modern architecture and architecture of the state actually became something special. It's part of a social contract. It was buildings by the state for the people. And I like to think of my work as political with a small p. This version of social democracy delivered a much more fair society and actually some wonderful buildings for us to learn, to be healed and to live in. And that's really where my work is centred and where this talk this evening will go. The building of a motorway is sculpture on an exciting grand scale, carving, moulding, forging and adapting the materials provided by nature, earth, rock and minerals into a finished product, which must be both functional and pleasing to the eye, as well as economical and durable. From the disciplinary perspective of architecture that prioritises space and form, it may seem obvious that infrastructure is composed of objects and not just networks, and that these objects have relationships with landscapes. Considering landscape and infrastructure in the late modern metropolis, cultural geographer Matthew Gandhi concluded that the combination of landscape with infrastructure necessarily brings questions of aesthetics and cultural representation into our analytical frame, and immediately unsettles a narrowly social scientific approach to the study of cities. Of course, the aesthetics and cultural representation of infrastructure has long been a concern for artists, perhaps the most high-profile being German photographers Bernd and Hiller Becher, whose strict typological approach to the record and comparative presentation of industrial structures deliberately objectified them to reveal their grammar. In the context of critical urban studies, Gandhi also wrote that much emerging literature lacks historical perspective. An overriding emphasis on policy relevance has ironically precluded many possibilities for critically rethinking the role of landscape and infrastructure. Since he wrote this in 2011, however, certainly in landscape and architectural histories, this perceived gap has been addressed in various ways. Belgian scholars in particular have advanced discussions about infrastructure's formative role in the creation and ordering of extended urban space, its networks and its landscapes. Here, I wish to think about Gandhi's ideas of aesthetics and cultural representation, using architectural historian Adam Shah's observations that buildings have multiple authors and that architecture is anticipated through contract drawings and documents. When translated into an infrastructural landscape setting, where co-production is a norm, and not only multiple authors, but also multiple agents impact on material form, the drawings and contracts provide ways of understanding divisions of responsibility, legislated spatial ordering, socio-cultural aspirations, and technical innovation. Historian Thomas Zeller's conception of the dual physical and discursive construction of landscape in the planning and construction of the Autobahn is also a useful tool with which to unpack the relationships between the formal outcomes of motorway construction and the preceding debate and discourse over their design and planning. Moreover, the production of a motorway landscape, particularly that of the M62, was not only bound with political, economics, technical prowess and social ambition, but faced the challenges of landform and historic patterns of settlement and use. Thus, the marketing documentation, the official cultural representation of the motorway, is valuable to the reading of the societal reception of completed undertakings in the same way as the drawings and contracts anticipate their beginnings. In this lecture, I will explore the planning, design and promotion of the motorway in relation to the term landscape and the manifold concerns embodied by this term. Writing as the M62 was in its planning stages, geographer J. Appleton recognised the palimpsestic nature of land use and its physical effects. He said, "Wherever people use land for some specialised purpose, this use tends to be reflected in the appearance of the landscape. If the forest is felled and replaced by an open field system, if the open fields are enclosed and covered by hedges, walls and fences, if later coal is brought up from 1,000 feet below and the spoil is strewn across the fields, each stage is marked by radical changes of a visible kind." His analysis of transport and the landscape used the case of the railways, arguing that they slashed like a knife through the delicate tissue of a settled rural civilization. He considered that those building the new motorways had inherited the mantle of the railway engineers and that the cuttings of the M62 promised to be more formidable than any on the railways. Motorways necessarily demand sites with one very specific characteristic: extensive linear tracts. Where other forms of land use more readily assimilate with preceding patterns, communications infrastructure asserts its form, albeit in dialogue with landscape. As a case study, in terms of its dual construction, anticipated through drawings and contract documents, the M62 in its landscape is a complex entanglement of political, technical, social, and geographical forces. Its construction as an extension of the urban realm into perceptibly rural or wild spaces also asks us to consider the wider physical networks of the city. In the case of the M62 in the Pennines, a sense of wilderness is reinforced by the first-person perspective in its upper reaches, where treeless moorland extends to the horizon in all directions. However, the Pennines have long been in service of the settlements that nestle in surrounding valleys, a manufactured landscape. Such a condition unsettles the sustained and artificial binary of urban versus rural. As a physical expression of an urban network, the M62 motorway can be used to understand ways in which immaterial, often invisible policy, governance and contracting are made concrete as manufactured industrial landscapes. In the construction of the M62, the landscape of the Pennines, already altered by human intervention, had another layer imposed upon its surface and carved through its peaks. Considered in formal terms, this visible sculptural exercise of cutting, filling and shaping the landscape in the disposition of earth and rock was governed by the largely invisible machinations of the administration determining its route, its height, its durability, and its functionality. The M62 motorway was officially opened by Queen Elizabeth II in an extended choreographed sequence on Thursday, the 14th of October, 1971. Its straddling of the boundary between the historically competing counties of Lancashire and Yorkshire meant that her visit included sites on both sides of the Pennines, beginning with Scamandon Dam. At Scamandon, in anticipation of the Queen's inaugural visit, a special hard surface turning circle was designed, replete with flagpole and the points of the compass marked out using concretes with different mixes and aggregates. Following the raising of the Royal Standard, the Queen and assembled dignitaries, many of whom were brought to the site by omnibus from Huddersfield, walked out across the water to examine the modern mannerist concrete valve tower designed by the relatively unknown John Strubb. The valve tower has matured to be one of the most striking visible cursors on this Trans-Pennine route, and its cylindrical body with incised pointy lid is inscribed in the minds of all who regularly make the traverse. Quite what Elizabeth II thought of it, and whether she ever followed her inaugural visit with another clandestine inspection, is open to speculation. The Queen continued onward to Milnrow Maintenance Depot. That's one for Michael, where an exhibition of drawings and models of the motorway was installed, and then departed for Rivington Service Area on the M61. Her day concluded at Leyland Railway Station, from where she departed for London. This combination of motorway, reservoir and service area encapsulated the regional drive in the modernisation of Britain, an intent to connect cities, to furnish them with new infrastructure and to support new industries. The M62, particularly at Scamandon, symbolised connectedness and cooperation through its construction, and the huge numbers of public and private sector agencies working collectively towards its realisation. It harnessed the idea of a national plan and was inflected through regional and local administrative structures in the delivery of a bigger objective. You might assume that scan from private collection is a private collection close to home. Transport economist David Starkey related the construction of British motorways to the 1945 Distribution of Industry Act, saying that with industry increasingly dependent on motor transport, better roads were seen as an important counterpart of such plans for reshaping Britain's economic and social geography. Most transport historians look to the Minister for Transport, Alfred Barnes's May 1946 announcement of a road plan, known as the Tea Room Plan, because a diagram was exhibited in the members' tea room of the House of Commons. And this was the basis for a national highway strategy, but also one that formed the framework for future town and country spatial planning, the siting of the new towns, for example. Political consensus in highway construction mirrored that of other post-war rebuilding programmes. Bound by scarcity and statute, the incoming Conservative administrations of Churchill, Eden and Macmillan had no choice but to adopt the programmes instituted under the Labour government of the 1940s. Up to 1953, only preparatory schemes could be made. These were effectively plans that further reinforced the routes that had been proposed in 1946. Even when government was convinced of the need for a new road, they still had to justify the expenditure via the Treasury. Most of the financial case was based on time-saving, and thus cost-saving, journeys that would be made and facilitated by the new routes. Such quantitative decision-making in government met with the qualitative interests of design and construction professionals, although the Ministry of Transport were reluctant to commit to either architects or landscape architects, being amongst those informing the development of statutory guidelines for motorways, urban or rural. The M62 motorway, especially the Pennine section, embodied ideas about the design of roads advocated by landscape architects from the middle of the 1950s. The sensation of the east to west traverse of the spine of England was described by David Rowlands in Design Journal in 1971. And he said, "In this short stretch, the motorway climbs from the outlying interchange with the A640 up to Polmore, where it enters a series of small cuts with attractive stepped rock slides. The panorama opens out as the road turns onto Scamandon Dam and the new lake with its distinctive valve tower close to the road on the eastern bank. From this point, the Dean Head cutting and Scamenden Bridge are clearly visible. In the cutting, there are views of Blackstone Edge, carrying the county boundary and the Pennine Way, and, rounding a bend, the road stretching up to Windy Hill across Moss Moor. Here the carriageways split on sidelong ground and curve around a farmhouse, its chimney smoking and hens clucking, as though nothing has happened in the last 4 years. This rich encounter of opening and closing vistas, punctuated by a series of close and distant foci, was no accident, but nor was it exclusively an act of design. More, it was a negotiation in three-dimensional space between a demand for a site with one unique characteristic, an immense longitudinal development, a set of topographical and geological constraints, a certain meteorological state, and other functional requirements. The UK Motorway Archive, specialist website, posits the outcome as an almost sculptural exercise of extraction and displacement, arguing that the motorway can be seen as a series of embankments and cuttings, levelling out the very irregular landscape it has to cross, and the embankments are built of the material excavated from the cuttings. Such a combination of influencing factors and modes of construction in the M62 created a route that satisfied the aesthetic ideals of those thinking about motorway design a decade earlier at the 1962 conference, Landscaping of Motorways. The event was organised by the British Road Federation and the Institute of Landscape Architects and held at the Institution of Civil Engineers. This constitution of organisations itself was testament to the multiple interests in the development of high-speed roads and a drive in some quarters for interdisciplinary practice. In terms of their interests, the Institute of Landscape Architects lobbied for their expertise to be taken into account in the design of roads from the 1930s. Brenda Colvin, a founder member of the Institute, was critical of the idea of beautification that typified approaches to the planting and landscaping of roads in the interwar period. She recognised that a fundamental shift in design for high-speed roads was required, arguing that the predominant horticulturally led approach did not account for the integration of roads into the landscape. Colvin was a pioneering figure and was instrumental in shaping the profession of landscape architecture as it moved from one being concerned with parks and private gardens to one that addressed entire visual fields. This shift in practice had to be accompanied by a shift in perception, away from notions that clumps of trees could increase pleasantness to the user, a view espoused by Sir Owen Williams speaking to the Royal Institute of British Architects in January 1956. This was an engineer's view of landscape architecture, but one that characterised a certain way of thinking, that motorways were ostensibly civil engineering exercises and that architects or landscape architects came in at the end to add a little bit of decoration. In 1953, talk to the Road Engineering Division of the Institute of Civil Engineers, Thomas Hutton outlined his grasp of planting for the motorways, with a focus on its utility and a gesture towards visual appearance. He said, "Hawthorn is excellent for retaining livestock, and if too much of it is considered monotonous, it can be relieved by interspersing plants such as maple and dogwood, which give good autumn tints. Beech, although not so strong as hawthorn, is also suitable, especially on chalk or limestone, and the coppery colour of the leaves in winter is always attractive. On heavy soils, hornbeam is preferable, but it is rather slow-growing." Owen Williams was responsible for the design of the M1 motorway connecting London to Yorkshire via the Midlands. Its design was widely criticised for its harsh angularity, its unrelenting straightness, and its lack of cohesion with the landscape. Amongst the critics were Brenda Colvin and her contemporary Sylvia Crowe, both of whom wrote treatises on how major roads could be assimilated with their context. The architecture and landscape professions largely reached consensus on the need for artistic and creative input at the early stages of a motorway's design. Such views and ideas were endorsed and elaborated upon at the 1962 conference and eventually echoed by highway engineers themselves. The aesthetics of road in the landscape, whilst a new concern in post-war Britain, were discussed earlier in North America and in continental Europe. Geoffrey Jellicoe considered the United States parkways as having made exemplary contribution to modern landscape architecture, although the later interstate roads were viewed less favourably. In the 1959 US publication, The Highway and the Landscape, an article by civil engineer F.W. Cron entitled The Art of Fitting the Highway to the Landscape, used a series of figures to show the preferred alignment, that's plan in English, and profile, that's section in English, to achieve a graceful combination with another illustrating the most effective way to display a beautiful bridge. Accompanying them were other diagrams of situations to be avoided, considered to be bad and dangerous, or to show up every bump, and a map showing visual splays across an imagined mountainous landscape. Such approaches captured the concerns about fitting roads into the landscape, but also accepted the inevitability of their development. This fait accompli was acknowledged by Sylvia Crowe in her conference address, where she stated that our landscape has got to be the setting for the road, and our great problem is to find out how we can get the road and the landscape brought closely together. Crowe had done more than most in terms of thinking around this matter. Her research and ideas were captured in the 1960 book, The Landscape of Roads. In it, she too presented visual studies of what she considered to be good and bad practice, making comparisons between typical British and German embankments, and showing how ornamental planting detracted from composition. Writing about the M1, Crowe argued that the line of the road was divorced from the shape of the surrounding land, and that its bridges were static in appearance. The criticism surrounding the design of the flagship project of the M1, as well as a government reluctance to involve architects in the early stages of designing urban motorways, seemingly galvanised those concerned with the appearance of roads and influenced the apparent consensus at the conference. In attendance were landscape architects and engineers, and all had very similar concerns in relation to aesthetics. The view from Germany, presented by former Nazi Party member Professor Alvin Seifert, endorsed commonly held views about flowing alignment providing not only the right appearance for the driver, but the right appearance when looked at from the outside. In this way, it becomes a natural part of the landscape for everyone. These two issues of driver experience and the appearance of the motorway within its landscape were the prevailing concern of most speakers. The driver's encounter was said to demand a constantly unfolding interest which leads the traveller on into the landscape beyond. Bridges were part of this locomotive scenography, and their outline was seen as important, and an oblique view, therefore, desirable. Other large objects in the landscape were thought to be valuable parts of such visual sequences and were welcomed as focal points on the road ahead, particularly if the road can be aligned to hold them in its sights. Curving roads were generally considered to enhance the view from the road and to reduce the monotony of driving. When combined with bridges and cuttings that opened and closed views of the landscape and framed other focal objects, the sweeping sensation of driving with constantly unfolding vistas was perceived as the optimal designed outcome within such technical civil engineering exercises. Perhaps following the backlash against the harsh intervention of the M1 into its landscape, curves were seen as advantageous to both appearance and experience. So much so that R.W. Rose, the county surveyor of the Isle of Wight, reported that Colonel Stuart Maynard Lovell boasted that in the West Riding of Yorkshire, straight lengths of motorway more than 1 mile are precluded as far as possible. Lovell was the county engineer and surveyor of the West Riding of Yorkshire and would be one of the lead figures planning the design and construction of the Yorkshire section of the M62. At this conference, he declared in forthright fashion that it was a matter of simple logic. There's a primary consideration in our approach to this subject of road construction must include aesthetics. In terms of the way in which motorways should fit with the landscape, flowing alignment was clearly important. Other concerns were said to be specific to the British landscape. One was the small scale and complexity of the English field pattern, which is so very vulnerable and easily violated by a heavy, careless hand. Brenda Colvin saw this as where landscape architects' involvement and collaboration at an early stage was vital in the shaping and siting of the road itself. in the shaping of the roadside verges and the central reservations, and so on. This notion of collaboration was picked up, perhaps unsurprisingly, by George Grenfell Baines, founder of one of Britain's first multidisciplinary practices, Building Design Partnership, where I began my formal career with Jonathan and Andrew. He was interested in the teamwork that is absolutely necessary for good and complete design, a sign of his grasp of the complexities of motorway construction and the need for collaboration in what was effectively the co-production of technically determined space with socio-cultural effects. Amongst the assembled professionals in 1962, there was little to no regard for environmental matters. Protest against the construction of motorways was generally regarded as selfish and detrimental to the national interest, a view founded on ideas of progress through modernisation. It was only in Sylvia Crowe's address that a sense of the wider, more holistic impact of motorway construction on the land and landscape subtly emerged. She argued for the construction of motorways without any wasteland, visual waste, or waste in the actual physical use of land. Some of this may have been based on matters of derelict land, especially the waste left by the coal industry across the North and Midlands. This particular issue was raised in Parliament before the outbreak of war in 1939 and remained a problem well into the post-war years. Eventually, the motorway programme contributed to the amelioration of this form of blight by changing sand quarries into lakes and recontouring and seeding waste tips. The M62 between Lofthouse and Ferrybridge used about 750,000 tonnes of waste colliery shale in its construction. Thus, the motorway's engagement with landscape went beyond simply their flowing alignments and were part of a multi-tiered, multi-agency approach to modernisation in the broadest possible terms. No more so than in the construction of the M62. Crossing the Pennines before the opening of the motorway was not easy. My dad will testify to that, travelling to see my mum from Leeds to Liverpool. The main roads were single carriageway and passed through urban centres. As motorised traffic increased in the 20th century, these routes were congested as well as beset by poor weather conditions in the winter, making them hazardous. The industrial expansion of the 18th and 19th centuries was supported by the canals and railways that connected the manufacturing powerhouses of the mill towns with the trading ports of Liverpool and Hull. In the post-war period, motor vehicles were seen as the future for transportation and distribution. They offered point-to-point journeys. Oil was seen to be plentiful and cheap, and matters of environmental damage via the release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere were not yet of concern. In some quarters, new motorways, it would argue, would even enhance well-being by letting the road traveller swiftly and surely through the vistas of beauty yet unknown to him, displaying the charms of rural England, Scotland and Wales, with glimpses of mountain, river and sea, reaching beauty spots with health and recreation for the town dweller and tired worker. Certainly the M62 would open up new vistas. Moreover, it would afford new infrastructure to be supported by it, as was the case for the coal-fired power stations of Drax, Eggborough and Ferrybridge, Boothwood Reservoir, and especially so in the design and construction of Scamondon Dam, across the top of which the carriageways of the M62 would run. As with the rest of the network, the general alignment of the Lancashire to Yorkshire motorway was set in 1946. Its western reaches were further fixed in the trailblazing Road Plan for Lancashire of 1949, authored by James Drake, the county surveyor and bridgemaster. In the early 1960s, Ernest Marple's general policy was that consulting engineers should be appointed for motorway projects. The County Councils Association protested to Marple's, and he offered them the opportunity to make representations in respect of any motorway where they felt that special circumstances existed, which in their view would justify a departure from that policy. Lancashire and Yorkshire must have had a strong case, with Drake and Lovell in positions of authority, County Surveyor for Lancashire and the County Engineer for the West Riding of Yorkshire, respectively. The pair were viewed as two motorway kings. Both were formidable professionals with progressive ideas and high expectations. Lovell's closing remarks in the 1962 conference, recorded in the Journal of the Institute of Landscape Architects, testify to his exacting standards. he stated, "There is no place for the substandard or mediocre, and our work will be judged in years to come, not by the technical, administrative, or other difficulties that were overcome, but by the soundness and beauty of the finished job." Drake's attitude to beauty was captured in the book he co-authored with his successor, Harry Eden, called Motorways, which they wrote in 1969. Reflecting the by then widely held opinion of construction professionals, he said that they must be pleasing to the eye, both of the motorist using it and of the person who views it from its surroundings. The motorway can open up hitherto unknown vistas of beauty of the area through which it passes, and these must be appreciated and allowed for in design. Both Drake and Lovell subscribed to the ideals promulgated earlier by the landscape architecture profession. Such views appear to have been widespread amongst the officers of the county authorities, with West Riding's county planning officer boldly declaring that this motorway system will be the county's shop window, and we are planning some large-scale window dressing. To accomplish the successful integration of the motorway into the landscape and to measure up to claims such as these, cooperation on a vast scale was required. The two county councils were agents of the Ministry of Transport, and a huge number of other agencies and companies were involved in the contracting, research, design and construction. Before this complicated work could commence, a detailed survey was required, as it was found that the existing Ordnance Survey maps of the Pennines contained insufficient information for the location work. Due to the scarcity of solid, stable features to act as reference points for the original survey, a comprehensive system of monuments was positioned across the whole site by three-dimensional coordinates to an accuracy of less than 1 inch. All the measurements are in old money. These monuments were located in places unlikely to be disturbed by the construction and used as bases from which to set out accurately the construction of the motorway. The surveyors went on to produce maps with contours at 1 foot intervals compared to the OS data, which only had 25-foot intervals. And the line of the motorway was finally fixed in late 1964. The challenge of building Britain's highest motorway across a dam necessitated some novel research and a vast array of people of different skills and abilities. The prevailing structures of the post-war nationalised state were evident, as the National Physical Laboratory, the Building Research Station, the Forestry Commission and the Road Research Laboratory all provided findings to aid the safe development of the scheme. Alongside the input of these agencies, statutory consultees in a typical motorway project included the National Coal Board, British Railways, British Waterways, other river authorities, the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, the Police, National Farmers Union, National Parks Commission, the Air Ministry and the Ministry of Agriculture. As well as consultees for the path of the motorway, the National Parks Commission were involved in the choice of a new route for the national trail, the Pennine Way, which had been instituted in April 1965. An elegant new footbridge was designed to carry walkers over the motorway, slightly to the east of its original line. This is one of Ed's favourite bridges. And I mentioned to Ed when I met him the other week, sort of started geeking out about bridges, that Maynard Lovell and his team in the west of Riding also designed my favourite retaining wall. Who doesn't have a favourite retaining wall? This is Droppingwell Footbridge on the M1, and also this marvellous viaduct of the A1 at Wentbridge. So they were very good at designing bridges. Beyond those providing research support and response to consultation, a project team consisted of engineers, contractors, lawyers, accountants, surveyors, valuers, town planners, administrators, machine operators, clerks, typists, skilled and unskilled workmen, and many others. Even local residents were co-opted into the research and planning phases, cooperating in a long-term meteorological study to pinpoint a route which would give maximum availability to traffic during severe weather. Different types and density of tree planting was tested to review the capacity for woodland to prevent snowdrifts. And a local farmer who grew his own plantations nearby was also consulted. Such was the perceived impact of winter, Lovell was reported to have considered double-decked, plastic-roofed sections of motorway and heating parts of the carriageway. The vast community of professionals and the public was part of the co-production of an infrastructural landscape that reached its zenith in the area around Scamandon, where multiple factors influenced the height, curves, cuttings and planting of the motorway. The name Scamandon is thought to have its origin in a Scandinavian personal name, Scambani, formed from the Norse words scammer, which means short, and bani, which means slayer, combined with the Old English denu, which means valley. The area incorporates the township of Dean Head, where a chapel stood from 1615 and was rebuilt in 1813. Mostly inadequate living from the land was supplemented by cloth making from as early as the 16th century, and by the middle of the 19th century supported a population of about 1,000. An ill-fated mill was built and never operated in the second half of the 1800s. The population dwindled as nearby towns grew, and the valley subsequently reverted to agriculture. In early 1962, William Jollins was appointed as water engineer and manager to Huddersfield Corporation. Recognising a foreseeable shortfall in the municipal water supply, covered in a brief report by his predecessor, Jollins set about assessing two proposed sites for a dam, of which Dean Head, which is Scamandon, was the most favourable. Not long afterwards, a county engineer visited the corporation and told us of plans to build a motorway across the Dean Head Valley. Jollins' account does not record which genius came up with the idea, but someone did boldly ask if one embankment might not serve a dual purpose, and no one ruled him out of order. Following a site inspection by the Waterworks Committee in October 1963, a delegation travelled to Whitehall in February 1964 to meet with officials at the Ministry of Local Government and the Ministry of Transport to present the possibility of combining a dam with a motorway. The powers to proceed were included in the Huddersfield Corporation Act 1965 and received assent on the 5th of August. Amongst the approved powers was the right for the compulsory acquisition of land to enable the development. Few properties remained in the valley, but farmer Wilfred Dyson fought for more than 4 years to prevent contractors from even accessing his land. Refusing to be bound over to keep the peace, he was imprisoned for 3 months in June 1969. This was one of a handful of acts of resistance against the motorway. Close by, the villagers of Outlane protested the loss of their community hall and shops. However, neither party managed to obstruct the imperative of achieving the Trans-Pennine link and traversing Scamandon Valley. Scamandon was the first phase of the M62 motorway construction. The 6-mile stretch from Windy Hill in the west to Polmore in the east was the highest and had the most difficult ground conditions. Its construction would determine the phasing of the sections to follow and began in August 1964. Between Windy Hill, the motorway's highest point, which is 1,221 feet above sea level, and the Dean Head cutting, the carriageways were built with very wide central reservation to give plenty of space onto which to remove snow. This is also where the carriageways curve around the fabled Stott Hall farm, and where the true story of stubborn farmer Wilfred Dyson may have been co-opted to create an enduring myth that the farmer steadfastly refused to sell his land, resulting in the motorway having to go around his property. The truth is much more prosaic. The ground conditions dictated the optimal route for the carriageways, and a geological fault lay beneath the farm. To the north lies Boothwood Reservoir, part of the infrastructural landscape that characterises this elevated and Spartan territory. It was built between 1967 and 1971 to supply water to Wakefield. Its construction ran parallel to that of the neighbouring dam, but was an entirely separate undertaking to that of the motorway and Scamandon. It's helpful at this point to invoke the idea of sculpture on an exciting grand scale, as phrased by James Drake and Harry Yeadon, and quoted at the opening of this lecture. The dam, the reservoir, the motorway, the bridge, the valve tower and outfall, the landscaping, fencing and lighting were all part of a three-dimensional composition, captured in some form by this sketch from the office of John Strubb. Imagining it in these terms, and as a product of the state realised through governance and contracting enables what Gandhi describes as a multidimensional analysis of the horizontal and vertical composition of space and the interrelationships between visible and invisible domains. The state structures created a series of contracts in which the design of the motorway was undertaken by the County Council of the West Riding of Yorkshire, acting as agents for the Ministry of Transport, itself subsumed within the Department of the Environment in 1970. Scamandon Reservoir was constructed for Huddersfield Borough Council, and the council acted as agent for the dam section of the motorway. The council's consulting engineers, Rove, Kennard and Lapworth, designed the dam and supervised construction. The valve tower, outfall and pump house were all designed by architect John Strubb, and the landscape was by John Blaney. The entire contract was carried out by Sir Alfred McAlpine and Son. These largely invisible acts and agreements, administered by contracts that connected various tiers of governments to the private sector and drew upon the research resources of the state, met with the visible reality of the Pennine landscape in an ensemble that epitomised the technological sublime. Technology and research informed the shapes and heights and dimensions of the new manufactured landscape. The new reservoir had to be integrated into the wider hydrological engineering of the Colne Valley, which required new tunnels, pumping stations and pipelines. The proposed system was drawn schematically by Jollens and underplays the complexity of relations between the existing system, existing topography and the new provision. In December 1968, two teams of tunnellers met one another 350 feet beneath the Pennines to create a link between the two catchment areas that would feed the system. The two tunnel headings were only 1/8 of an inch apart in floor levels as they broke through to make the connection, where a bottle of whiskey was shared by the foreman and a speech was read through an underground mist laden with gelignite fumes. The historical canal system was also affected by the construction of the dam, and the complex negotiations captured in wonderful prose, again by Jollens, who said, "The metaphorically clear blue water of the canal authorities intermingled with the yellow water of the mill owners and the red water to which Huddersfield felt entitled in such a variety of intermediate shades that the water from Lancashire was so diluted by Yorkshire water that no alchemist could possibly separate them." The final settlement was a compromise that secured compensation water for the canal and the River Colne, and that integrated the main canal reservoirs into the new scheme. These agreements were also underwritten by clauses in the 1965 Huddersfield Act. A combination of pumping and gravity feed, dependent on reservoir levels, sent water to the expanded treatment works at Longwood. Like the motorway, the water system, guided by construction and legal contracts in negotiation with the existing manufactured landscape, was part of this extended urban field with tangible dams, tunnels, reservoirs, treatment plants, and intangible elements, rain, shifting peat bogs, combining to form the whole. The dam itself was not only technically complicated, but contractually so too. Extended correspondence between the Ministry of Transport and Huddersfield Corporation discussed who would pay for the construction of the dual-purpose structure and how the costs of its maintenance would be split. Marginalia on copies of drawings show how ministry staff used Jollens' comparative cross-sectional drawings to try and calculate the additional proportion of material required for the dam motorway hybrid, above and beyond either artefact being constructed singularly. Jollens' view of the settlement was that the apportion of costs between the Ministry of Transport ended up in a broad compromise after a lot of complicated formulae had been considered. Further plans showed the novation of spatial governance in the post-construction phase. The Act provided for the corporation to maintain the short length of motorway over the site of the dam. The Ministry of Transport hoped that the corporation could be persuaded to subcontract this obligation to the County Council, the agent authority for the continuous lengths. And here you can see the conveyancing plan for that novation, and this zigzag figure in the middle of the plan is this access into the reservoir here in this strangely kind of Aztec aesthetic. The vertical datum at which the top of the dam was set was, like the legal agreements that preceded it, a negotiation. In this context, it was a negotiation between achieving optimal weather conditions on the carriageways, collecting the requisite volume of water behind the dam, the engineering of a new bridge to cross the Dean Head cutting, and the gradients on approach from east and west. The eventual agreed height of the dam, 249 feet, was to a large extent determined by the fact that the M62 along its crest should not have too steep a gradient, and across the length of the dam, as far as possible, be horizontal. The two primary meteorological hazards were and remain snow and fog. Even a slight lowering of the carriageway through the cutting substantially reduced the chances of hill fog affecting driving conditions, and you can see this in Kevin Crook's wonderful photographs. At Windy Hill, a few miles west of Scamondon, where the cutting was 120 feet lower than the ridge, it's quite common to see ragged clouds scudding along the moorlands, while the carriageways of the M62 remain free of fog. The depths of the cuttings, as well as their profiles, impacted on the width of these newly formed gullies, and thus the engineering design of any subsequent bridge crossings. The profiles were stepped following exhaustive tests at the National Physical Laboratory, in which artificial snow, powdered balsa wood, was blown into the scale model. This technique was found to encourage the formation of snowdrifts on the steps and not on the carriageways. The laboratory research was supplemented by two full-scale mock-up test embankments that corroborated the findings. The Dean Head cutting was eventually set at 180 foot, thought to be the deepest such excavation in Europe at the time. A special method of blasting was developed, where large numbers of explosives were detonated within fractions of seconds of one another, creating rock fragments that were suitable sizes to be used in the dam construction without further sorting or treatment. The new fixed arch bridge above the cutting was the largest of its type in the UK. Its massive qualities, according to civil engineer Geoffrey Hunter, went underappreciated as it was dwarfed by the vastness of the landscape around it. The wider landscape was also subject to alteration. Clay from cuttings further east at Lofthouse and Gilderson was used to line the reservoir and the dam after huge amounts of peat bog were dug out to reach the solid rock base. The excavated peat was removed and placed in specially selected areas along the motorway and landscaped to blend in with the surrounding countryside. At the time, it was seen to have no agricultural, horticultural, or other commercial value. According to the Department of Environment, it was so glutinous that dump trucks with heated bodies had to be used to ensure a clean discharge and thus a full payload each trip. Such was the technological feat of seeming to conquer the wild moors with infrastructure that was the highest, biggest and longest, that The Guardian dubbed it the motorway of superlatives. Triumphant prose in the national press, predicated via an organised tour, was mirrored in local newspapers and in the official marketing documentation produced by the Department of the Environment. The Queen's reference to an outstanding feat of engineering was reported in the Huddersfield Daily Examiner and the Yorkshire Post. McAlpine's promotional report used the subheading, "A unique dam motorway project," and the official Department of the Environment record referred to the daunting variety of construction problems, resulting in innovations that were streamlined, impressive, and similarly unique. The results would be that by the mid-1970s, the 200-mile journey from Liverpool to Hull will be cut from 5 exhausting hours to an easy cruise of 2 hours. Postcards were issued showing the completed dam that were testament to the marvel of the engineering and its combination with the landscape. Much like the statutory requirement for the Central Electricity Generating Board to provide amenity, ways in which the dam could be used recreationally were considered from its planning stages. Scamondon Water Sailing Club was formed in 1971 and was a typical use promoted by many municipalities in their reservoirs, as was fishing that was also licensed. More unusually, the road to the pump house on the downstream side of the dam was designed using advice from the Royal Automobile Club to make it suitable for speed hill climbing. The deliberately twisting ascent was lined on the dangerous bends by a steel Armco barrier paid for by a petroleum company. Car parking for events was catered for in adjacent fields, and the terrain of the dam gave excellent viewing for spectators. Spectating the motorway itself from a bleak picnic area was reported scornfully by The Guardian, suggesting that motorway watching should appeal to those families who like nothing better than sitting in a lay-by and munching sandwiches as they watch traffic pouring past. Personally, I think that the view still captures the technological sublime. Of course, the idea that people should gain pleasure from both the view from the road and the view of the road was enshrined in the early proclamations by landscape architects, and this particular view of the road satisfied such aspirations. The combination of factors that led to the route, form and crossings of the M62 over the Pennines also created a series of experiential moments that epitomised the sculptural ideas set out as diagrams in the publications of the late 1950s and early 1960s. Where Design Journal described travelling from east to west, I would like us to consider the west to east, Lancashire to Yorkshire journey, and the sequence of views and vistas contained by the monumental landscaping and framed by the bridges as the carriageways ascend and traverse the Pennine moorland. From Milnrow, the motorway begins to rise, bounded by a shelter belt of trees to the left. The mound of an Iron Age hill fort at Newhay leads the gaze to the middle distance on the right. The carriageway widens to accommodate a climbing lane through the shallow Tuns Hill cutting, traversed by a level bridge that frames the mound of the next incision as the lanes curve to the right. A short glimpse of the distant Shore Moor is gathered as rapidly as a breath. Suddenly, in the crossing of the Rakewood Viaduct, the entire landscape opens up, Hollingworth Lake to the left in the valley, and the Dragonback Ridge connecting Nicholas Pike to Windy Hill on the right. The ridge stays in view as the climb continues, and the overbearing heft of Lowhouse Moor is cut, pinned and retained on the passenger side. The entrance to the Windy Hill cutting curves and cups as its steps arise, and almost at its close, the elegant galloping footbridge carrying the Pennine Way captures the unfolding view beyond. Now, at the motorway's highest point, Rishworth Moor and Moss Moor extend to the horizon. The winding, opening carriageways lead the eye past the clucking hens to the gently rising approach of Dean Head. As the road bears right and climb tops out, the magnificent Scamenden Bridge is object and device, powerful in its own right, and a portal to the sequence to come. The following straight of the dam-top section reveals the twisting valley to the north, its ending never in view. The dark water of the reservoir is forever brooding, and a castellated cylindrical valve tower, its top spliced into quarters by cruciform incision, stands sentinel over the shimmering dank. As fast as it can be taken in, it disappears, and the rising exit from the scene curves away, mirroring its approach. Of course, my intent here is to mimic David Rowland's depiction of his encounter with the motorway in 1971, but also to communicate the success in experiential terms of the design of the M62 motorway. The way that the ascents, curves, cuttings and bridges work with the landscape exemplify the sketched ideas contained in the early publications referred to at the outset of this lecture. Indeed, some of the sketches could be overlaid to correspond directly with the real spaces engineered and manufactured through the hills of the Pennine Moors. The final route could be attributed solely to geological and topographical constraints, and its rich encounters simply a product of engineering. But I argue that its aesthetics are a piece of cultural representation. Explicitly and evidentially, there was not a single hand guiding the outcome of the motorway as a designed experience. The results were the product of co-production and show how Whitehall ministries of government, local government, research agencies, publics and professionals all impacted and influenced on the creation of this infrastructural space. The landscapes of infrastructure are constructed both physically and socially at the same time, and are the technological creations with socio-cultural implications beyond the bounds of the hard shoulder or the fence line. The view of the road and the view from the road were made in the image of the society that built them, as modes of governance, a nationalised state, and a consensual attitude to modernisation drove the country's growth and development through the 1960s and into the early 1970s. But we know how to build roads and how to safeguard them. And it may be that when we have got them out of our system, or rather into our system, we may learn to change focus. So wrote Lionel Brett, Viscount Lord Esher, in 1965. He was referring to the A roads and bypasses of Oxfordshire, a county he considered to be a landscape in distress. But he may as well have been foreshadowing the shift in ideals around motorways. The energy crisis of the 1970s peaked in 1973 with oil in short supply and at inflated prices. It led to energy-saving technical change and an increased popular focus on environmental concerns. In January 1974, architectural design presented a drawing of a tree styled as a clenched fist, showing solidarity with the planet. Behind it was a rising sun, and the editorial lead was solar energy. This was the first such explicit dedication in the British architectural press and signalled wider change. As Thomas Zeller observes, the problem of how to situate a road within a landscape, which was to be solved aesthetically, turned into the problem of finding a route that would cause the least ecological damage. In tandem with changing opinions about the environment, cars were faster and more reliable, and with increased power came increased risk. The weather conditions of the M62 in winter only amplified the danger. To respond to this, a highly automated warning system designed by the Department of the Environment in consultation with the police and the county councils was installed on the motorway. Wind speed and direction indicators, temperature, humidity and salinity indicators, visibility indicators and strategically sited television cameras were supposed to feed information to computers in control centres. Certain data combinations would elicit actions such as the deployment of gritter trucks to combat icy carriageways. In December 1977, despite the technological assurance, in one night, approximately 40 vehicles were involved in 8 separate incidents that left 1 dead and 7 injured. 12 months prior, a 50-vehicle incident led to 10 injuries. The same year as the opening of the M62, it was suggested that the age of lovely views from the passing car is over. The man behind the wheel must not take his eyes off the bumper of the car in front of him. Looking the wrong way for a second can have dire consequences. No longer new, the motorway system crept into our everyday, and the sense of it as a marvel faded as roads grew busier and more congested. Pollution in all its forms, light, air and noise, was synonymous with the motorway, and notions of the motorway as malignant became popularly entrenched. The idea that the motorway might have a designed aesthetic was forgotten, as its spectacle was obscured from view by the metaphorical fog of necessity. However, the virtue of the M62 was sustained. Beyond simply its use as a leisure landscape, the motorway became a marketing tool for development and growth in the region. Huddersfield, that had so much to offer, showed itself as connected to the rest of the north in adverts for prospective residents, and the new metropolitan county of West Yorkshire showed its position at the centre of the north and astride the coast-to-coast economic axis of the M62. And interestingly, this advert published on the 1st of April 1974 as the new metropolitan counties came into being. Here I've used documents that anticipated its construction and those that came afterwards to explore the idea of the M62 as a technical object, a sculptural object, and a cultural object. Its design was a combination of political, technical, and social production, and its aesthetic eventually satisfied the calls of the landscape architecture profession for cohesive integration into its site. Its construction built on centuries of manufactured landscapes and created new infrastructural landscapes of the 20th century, extended linear fields dealing with water, power, and mobility, serving urbanisation. Whilst focused on Scamandon as the most complex artefact in this complicated construction, The entire motorway resonates with this design quality, a manifestation of strong local government and nationalisation. Without borough engineers and county surveyors like Jollens, Lovell and Drake, such comprehensive approaches and holistic views are unlikely to re-emerge.